Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I've recently read or sometimes that I'm currently reading. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so I have some catching up to do. I'm taking advantage of a kind of rare semi-warm day in December to do a little bit of filming outside. So I got a little bit of a glaring sun, but I didn't want to be cooped up in the house today. So the ones that I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to talk about some of the books that I read recently. I'm going to do a second video, just kind of break it up a little bit. These two books are ones that I finished in November for nonfiction November. And I am predominantly a nonfiction reader anyway. So for nonfiction November, I decided to limit myself to books that I've had on my shelves for over 10 years. Sorry if you hear the traffic going by. Books for over 10 years that were on my shelf that I just never got to for one reason or another. They're kind of books that are just outside my general interest in reading, so they kept getting passed up. And I got tired of looking at them on the shelf and decided I'm just going to read them, and we'll see. And the two books I'm going to talk about today, they were both purchased in the late, probably a little before 2010. And in certain ways, they represent something of my 20s, my years, my 20s, especially sort of my, little bit of a political awakening of the world. So the two books I'm going to be talking about are Last Words by George Carlin, his autobiography, really. And the other one I'm going to be talking about is John Krakauer, Where Men Win Glory. So first let's talk about Carlin. I was a teenager in the 90s. I grew up certainly with a lot of cynical music. Certainly I was listening to a lot of Tool, a lot of Alice in Chains, Nine Inch Nails. So I was kind of trained in the 90s to question. Certainly there was some cynicism of youth culture in the 90s that can be a little bit, obnoxious in retrospect. But it was a generation that knew that they were being kind of marketed to and played, and there was a big self-awareness in those sorts of things. The first presidential election that I was able to vote in was Bush versus Gore. And when that election first began, I had no idea what side of politics I was on. I didn't know if I was Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever it might be. So my political awakening really came about during those debates and watching Bush and Gore and looking at the platforms of the political parties. And I very quickly realized that I was somebody who was much more to the left in politics, and which political party, at least at that time, was right for me. I've gone through a lot of changes. I'm not at all on the right, but certainly disillusioned with certain political aspects. And I bring this up because right after, of course, the election of Bush and Gore, the following year, we had in 2001, you had 9/11. Followed very quickly by the war in Afghanistan, and then the Iraq war, and you had certainly a lot of flag waving. Some people in fear of being against, especially the second war, the Iraq war. The way everybody was kind of towing the line. There was kind of a sense of everybody going lock and step, and I realized things were changing, especially. It was shortly after 9/11. Before 9/11, when I was in high school, I had become an atheist. I realized I didn't have any kind of faith. And this is before the new atheist movement of like Dawkins and Harris and everything else. It wasn't in vogue in any way. Defined material on atheism was actually much more difficult, especially if you were a teenager. In the 90s. And when you found other people who were unbelievers, especially if they were celebrities, it really made you take notice. Now I don't think anybody cares. But in the 90s, that was something that you paid attention to. So after 9/11, I remember pulling up to my job where I worked, and I had the radio station on. It was modern rock radio station, alternative. It was made for a crowd my age. And I just remember they had this public service announcement come on, and it basically said, "We are Americans. We believe in, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness." It was this whole thing. And then amidst it said, "We believe in one God." And I was really surprised. You can imagine probably that's what they put inside this public service announcement of what an American is. And of course pagans, polytheists, they're out of the question, but certainly atheists were as well. And I realized that, I'm sitting here as somebody who's a patriotic American, somebody who loves my country and who was devastated when it was attacked. Not being included in this list. So I was already feeling out of step with a lot of what was going on at that time. And then that's kind of when I really started paying attention to George Carlin. I had known George Carlin, of course, from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and Bogus Journey, and I was aware that he was a comedian, but I didn't really go through and watch his acts. But then when he was an old man, you can say a little bit of a bitter, cynical old man, I started watching him. And it's not that I found him laugh out loud funny, but to see somebody on stage criticize the government and our history and authority, and not do it in an unpatriotic way, actually. Do it in a way that it felt like to me, this wasn't somebody who was young who was doing this, these kind of angry, cynical musicians that I grew up with. This was somebody gray-haired and elderly, way older than me, who was doing it. And it felt, when I was watching George Carlin as somebody who was like 20 years old, it felt like watching, somebody older pulling back the curtain and letting me know that, first of all, my own mistrust maybe wasn't unfounded when it came to government and history and everything else. The fact that also he was criticizing religion as well. He's one of the few people who was openly doing that during that time. I certainly found something of a kindred spirit in him when I would watch those acts. The later acts especially is what I'm talking about, when he was older. So when he passed away, I remember this coming out shortly after, and I saw this, it was in Borders, and I picked it up then. And this was, as you can imagine what I just said, published after he died, but he had basically been writing this with Tony Hendra for almost 2 decades, and Tony Hendra finished it up. So I bought it intending to read it. Of course, a decade went by, more than a decade, and I hadn't gotten to it. And then I actually went through this along with the audiobook. The audiobook is abridged, which I generally stay away from abridged audiobooks. I don't like them. But that audiobook was read by his brother. It was Patrick, I believe. I think it was Patrick Carlin, his older brother, who was dear to George Carlin, and who also sounds remarkably like him. I mean, there were times I was listening to the audiobook, and I would swear it was George Carlin talking. They sound almost exactly the same. So for those reasons, I would listen to the book some, and then I would go through the pages, kind of go through and see what I missed. And it didn't seem like I was missing anything important, actually, through the audiobook. But I was glad that I had kind of both experiences as I would kind of go through this. And I enjoyed this. This was pretty good. I mean, it really is basically an autobiography, partly of his life, but it's also part of his artistic journey, about his own sort of fall away from religion, his political awakening, how it fed into his acts and his art. He kind of started off as somebody who was kind of an impressionist in the 1960s, and then in the 1970s he did a lot of daily life, isn't it funny that, kind of observational humor. And then in the 80s, moving more and more towards a little more of a political consciousness. And I thought all that stuff was actually really fascinating. There are certainly funny moments. Learning about him and his life, it honestly made me like him even more than I already did. So I am glad that I read this one. Last Words by George Carlin. In addition to that, another thing that happened around the in my 20s, something similar. Had to do with Pat Tillman. Pat Tillman was a professional football player who kind of famously, gave up a multi-million-dollar contract in order to join the Army. After 9/11, felt like it was his patriotic duty, and he ended up being killed in Afghanistan. And at first it was reported that he was killed in action, I think an ambush. And then it was revealed that no, that was a lie. He was actually killed in friendly fire. And both sides really kind of started using Pat Tillman. And what this book really gets at is neither side used him in a way that reflected who he actually was. And first of all, I knew who John Krakauer was. So when I bought this, I knew the author. I'd read Into the Wild, I had read Under the Banner of Heaven. And I actually like both of those books. Pat Tillman interested me, not because I'm a football fan. I'm not. I never got into it. But I remember his memorial service, where Senator John McCain spoke. A bunch of people spoke, and they were all saying basically, "Oh, he's in heaven now. But we'll see him again someday." And then I remember his younger brother Richard. It's kind of vivid in my mind. He got up on stage at the podium, and he was holding a beer. I think it was a Guinness. And he seemed kind of drunk, but I don't think he quite was drunk. I think he was just actually upset, even though he was holding the beer. And he essentially said, "Listen, I appreciate all your words of prayer and everything like that, but he's not in heaven." He said, "We don't believe in that. We don't believe in God. He's an atheist. Pat's just dead. He's just gone." And again, I talked about my own deconversion, and these sorts of things would stick out to me when I would see them. And it was extraordinary to me because it also helped to dispel some of my own stereotypes, some of my own preconceived notions. You hear about this, big football player, patriotic duty to go join the war. There are certain assumptions, because I am an American, I do know something about my country. The general line that would follow. Oftentimes that would also involve, a Bible and, a good Christian boy, or, there was usually often a religious aspect to these things in those people's lives. And the fact that wasn't true of Tillman gave me pause. There he is on the back there. So it made me think, oh, okay, so Tillman wasn't the person that I assumed he was already. So I thought I wanted to know more about him, and I already liked John Krakauer's work. So I figured I'd give this a try. And especially I wanted to know about the sort of government cover-up and the lies that happened after he died. And this ends up being something of an odd mixed bag for me. Krakauer does a very good job of explaining the situation in Afghanistan through from the Soviet period up through the basically the Afghan Civil War to the U.S. invasion. He does a good job with that. And as he's talking about that, he's paralleling it with Pat Tillman's life. And by parallel, I mean, they're not coinciding at all. It's just in time, he's bouncing back and forth. And some of that stuff with Pat Tillman, I was having a harder time getting into the book. Especially when Krakauer goes to these long descriptions of the football games, which I just personally didn't care about. But then we get to a point where we start actually reading Pat Tillman's diaries. He was an extensive journal keeper, and you start getting just direct words from Pat Tillman. And I personally ended up really liking the guy. He was incredibly thoughtful about what he was doing. He was not somebody who unquestioningly, followed authority or the military. He was actually very, very much against actually the war in Iraq. He still would have, he was a soldier, would have done whatever they told him to do. But he was angry and disgusted by it. To see his perspective and him struggling with the choices he makes in life and whether or not the military was really the right thing for him, and thinking about his wife and, what are things going to be like when this is all done. And we follow this all the way through, of course, to his death. And the sort of cover-up, the memorial service, and it kind of goes through that. Krakauer also gives us some other situations in which American military personnel captured, killed in various, come to harm in the line of duty, but having their stories manipulated and outright, told through lies by the government. So that seems to really be what this book is about. It's like that's what Krakauer wanted to be about, but he didn't quite let it be that entirely, about government cover-ups and how they use soldiers to kind of fit their own narrative, even though it's sometimes very far from the truth. So we have that, but then, and this whole idea of both the left and the right trying to claim Pat Tillman, but both sides getting him wrong in how they portray him. That's another aspect of this book. So as I was going through this, I'm like, okay, I'm with him. It seemed really interesting. We get to the part in the book where there's the memorial service, the one that I remembered so vividly in my mind, right? The one that made me take notice of Pat Tillman in the first place. And he talks about John McCain going up and giving these kind of religious words, to Pat Tillman in his service. And then we never see Richard Tillman. That moment that was so stuck in my mind, and also that seemed to fit so well with Krakauer's, you can almost say, thesis. How people were trying to portray Tillman in a way that he wasn't, how they were using him. That seemed to fit so perfectly with everything that Krakauer was talking about, and he doesn't put it in there. And I was just thought that was a very odd and almost telling omission. So I looked up Richard Tillman and John Krakauer, and it seems like these two did not get along. I saw one quote where Richard Tillman basically calls him an SOB or something like that. It seems like the Tillman family was actually ultimately maybe unhappy with the way that Krakauer ended up handling things. And I thought that was a very odd, like I said, omission. And I don't know if it was personal conflict with Richard Tillman that made him not include it, or what happened. But it did surprise me, and made me question some of the other things that maybe were omitted. So I thought this was a decent reading experience. I do wish that Krakauer just kind of like came out with a thesis and stuck to it, rather than trying to do seeming too many things within the book. But anyway, I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad that I certainly read both of these. They kind of brought me back to that period in my life where I was kind of figuring myself out politically, where I was learning more about the world and government and war and how these things operate. So these kind of represent moments in that journey. If you're a Carlin fan, I would recommend this. I don't know if this is the kind of book that I would keep long term. I'll put it on my shelf for now, but if I end up needing room, I'll probably pass it forward. And I'm still kind of thinking about how we feel about this book in the end. But anyway, those are the two books that I read. If you've read either of them, I'd love to hear your comments. But anyway, thank you, BookTube.